Penguin Random House Audio presents Khosrow and Shirin by Nezami Ganjavi, translated from the Persian with an introduction and notes by Dick Davis, read for you by Peter Ganim and Mozhan Navabi with Dick Davis.
Introduction. Nezami Ganjavi, who lived from 1141 to 1209, was born in the city of Ganje, in what is now independent Azerbaijan, and seems to have spent his whole life either in Ganje itself or in its immediate environs. There is no record of his ever having travelled anywhere outside of the province, of which Ganje was the capital and cultural centre. The region was inhabited by both Persian-speaking Iranians and Azari-speaking Turks, and although its court culture was largely Persian or at least Persian-oriented, the ruling families tended to be ethnically more Turkish than Persian. This ethnic hybridity is something that Nezami was clearly conscious of, and it was probably compounded by the fact that his mother was neither Azari nor Persian, but Kurdish. He was orphaned at a young age and brought up by an uncle, and this too may well have contributed to a sense of a life lived partly in and partly outside of an identifiable cultural milieu. The whole nature of Nezami's poetry, its rhetoric, conventions, subject matter, and underlying preoccupations, mark it as being court poetry. But, despite the fact that his poems were dedicated to members of ruling families, unlike almost all medieval Persian poets whose names have come down to us, Nezami was never formally attached to a specific court, which also seems to suggest a certain consciously outsider status. His poetry contained some evidence that he had a rather jaundiced view of courts and the culture that went with them. At one point in Khosrow and Shirin, he breaks off the narrative to address the reader directly. Be patient. Close your eyes, and from a sea of good advice accept a drop from me. I've given kings such wealth, and had to learn to be prepared for nothing in return. My words were gratis. I was handed nothing, and I expected and demanded nothing. The sentiment is conventional. Ferdowsi, who lived from 940 to 1020, whose poetry was immensely important to Nezami, makes a very similar remark at the end of his Shahnameh, or Book of Kings. But that doesn't mean it wasn't also heartfelt, and there is enough additional evidence that Nezami was wary of court life, despite the fact that it was the ultimate source of his income as a poet, to make his complaint more than merely credible. Nezami wrote enough relatively short poems in the form of ghazals, poems that take love as their central subject matter, and qasides, essentially praise poems, though qasides were also written on other subjects, to fill a substantial book. But his fame rests on his khamse, his 5 book-length poems. Khamse means 5 or quintet. The Treasury of Secrets, Makhzan al-Asrar, Khosrow and Shirin, Layla and Majnun, The 7 Portraits, Haft Peykar, and The Book of Alexander, Iskandarname. The first of these is a collection of loosely connected Sufi anecdotes, clearly modelled on The Garden of the Truth, Hadigat al-Haqiqat, by the 11th-12th century poet Sana'i, who lived from 1080 to about 1140, which means that he died around the time that Nezami was born. The next 3 are love stories, and the last is a verse treatment of the Alexander legend, which had as much currency in the medieval Islamic world as in the medieval Christian world, divided into 2 parts, the first of which treats Alexander as a world conqueror, the second as a kind of proto-Sufi, who travelled the world in search of wisdom rather than conquest. The love stories are, as it were, bookended by 2 book-length poems connected with Sufism, and Sufism is certainly an element within the love stories themselves, though how much of an element is debated, with strenuous supporters for both sides of the argument. The poems are to be read as wholly Sufi in their concerns, versus Sufism as merely a decorative flourish, an added flavour, in what are basically carnal love stories. that Nezami treats Alexander as both a protagonist whose arena is the world of politics and warfare, and as a searcher for spiritual truth, indicates an ambiguity of focus which is also clearly discernible in the love stories. This suggests that, in the argument between the secular and the spiritual interpretations of these tales, an approach of both and rather than either or is a more productive way of looking at them, or at least one that will bring us closer to the way that Nezami himself engaged with his poem's subject matter. The three love stories have always had much more currency than Nezami's two other long poems, in that they are read and loved by more people, as well as having had much more scholarship devoted to them. Of the three, if Layla and Majnun is the best known, it can claim to be the most famous Middle Eastern love story of all, on a par with Romeo and Juliet in the West. And the Seven Portraits has been regarded as the most sophisticated and complex and in need of exegesis. Khosrow and Shirin has been by far the best loved, at least in Iran, by Iranians and by Persian speakers in general. There is also a general consensus that it is the most personal of Nezami's poems, the one closest to his own heart, and for which he is believed to have had a special affection, to the extent that the poem's female protagonist, Shirin, has been seen by some as a portrait of his first wife, who died while still a young woman. Nezami quite quickly came to be considered the greatest of the medieval Persian poets who wrote book-length romances. Although he was preceded by a few other poets working in the same genre, and followed by a great many others, none has ever seriously challenged this position of preeminence. This would seem to have been the case almost from the beginning, since of the three extant or partially extant Persian verse romances that preceded Nezami's works, one, Gorgani's Vis and Ramin, survives in only 4 manuscripts. One, Ayuki's Varghe and Golshah, survives in a single manuscript, and one, Ansari's Vameg and Azra, insofar as it has survived at all, exists only in fragments of a single manuscript. This suggests that once Nezami's poems were available, the market and audience for all preceding verse romances in Persian virtually disappeared. It's also clear that Nezami's work was seen as not only superseding previous examples of the genre, but as fundamentally changing the genre's nature, because Nezami's example subsequently became such an influential component of the fabric of Persian romance, and thence of Romance literature generally, its radical innovativeness may not at first be apparent. To put it very broadly, to move from the pre-Nezami Persian romances to Nezami's romances is to move from entertainment to ethical admonition, from charm to seriousness, from the virtual certainty of a happy ending to possibilities of tragedy, and from the resolutely secular to at least suggestions, and sometimes much more than suggestions, of spiritual allegory. To put it another way, it's to move from poetry as a kind of Mozart divertimento to poetry as the equivalent of something like a Beethoven symphony. Neither is intrinsically more valuable than the other, but one makes much more apparently strenuous demands on the listener. It is also to move from a world in which characters stay the same throughout a work, as is typical of both medieval Islamic and Christian literature in general. There is very rarely such a thing as character development in medieval literature, at least before Nezami, to a world in which at least the protagonist changes, develops, and, in the terms of the culture which produced these narratives, spiritually grows. In a way, the stories are like the conversion anecdotes that can be found in medieval biographical works that deal with the lives of Sufis. Someone who has led a reprehensible, or at best a mundane and insignificant life, is brought by some event or other, a miracle, a meeting with another Sufi, to change their ways and turn towards a nobler and more praiseworthy way of interacting with the world, with God, and with their own spiritual reality. But for all his innovativeness, Nezami had not turned his back on the literary tradition he inherited. Rather, he transformed the tradition by combining elements within it that had hitherto existed more or less separately. His first long poem, The Treasury of Secrets, was the compendium of Sufi Orient.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?